Hi, everyone. Well, we're flying high over Maiden Hill during the roaring 20s. And there comes a time for Mayday. There comes a time for a crash. And we know that that is in the future, but let's enjoy it while it lasts. Speaking of which, my computer just crashed and I had a hard time getting my microphone to work and my video to work. And so I'm just happy to be here, and I hope you are too. So we're going to talk a little bit about technology and the advances of the Roaring 20s. This is the second installment of our blues unit, and we're thinking about many things when we say the word blues. We're thinking about the fact that there was a new kind of music created during the time of the Harlem Renaissance, and it was a music that had been around in the African American community, and it was called the blues. And it was a music that expressed emotion, specifically emotions that were struggles, that were difficult in life. I also want you, though, to think about the wild blue yonder, and that's going to be a major theme of this video. We're going to talk about how human beings were able to get off the ground, literally. Now, there had been hot air balloons and things like that even back in the Civil War and earlier, but they were unreliable and frankly quite dangerous. You know, when you're up there in a hot air balloon, you really are at the mercy of the wind and the waves sometimes, right? If you drift over the ocean or whatever might happen. So I want to talk about some key developments and some key people during the 1920s, people who developed technology specifically in the area of science. So we're going to start with a man whose name is almost a synonym for the development of new technology, and his name is Henry Ford. He was just an ordinary person, but his ideas brought together many developments. First of all, the automobile wasn't his invention. He often gets credit for that, but automobiles were being developed in the late 1800s and over a long period of time. Once the train, the locomotive or the railroad got going, people knew that the future was to have a vehicle that could take you wherever you needed to go without the railroad tracks. Well, and by the way, Mitsubishi in Japan is the oldest motor company in the world. That's an interesting fact. But Henry Ford gets credit for bringing together an idea to use an assembly line to create automobiles at a low cost. And so his idea was you'd have instead of having people making an automobile all at once, or instead of having one person work on the whole automobile, you'd have a conveyor belt, that's looping around and things are moving along the conveyor belt. And that meant that each person had only one job. Maybe their job was to tighten a screw, or maybe their job was to put on a hubcap on the wheel, or to actually put the wheel on, or to drop the engine in, or whatever. And so as the assembly line, the conveyor belt moved forward, each person would do their part, and it was extremely fast. And automobiles were produced much quicker and much cheaper. Now, when something is produced cheaply, you need to ask, well, who's making it and how can they make money? Obviously, the biggest concern is how much are people getting paid to do that repetitive job? And the reality was that Henry Ford believed in this idea of mass production with an assembly line, but also high wages. And so he actually was a proponent for higher wages for workers. Now, that didn't solve all of the problems of this process, because when a person is not experiencing the building of an entire thing, in this case a car, you don't get the joy of completing your product. You don't even see the big picture at all. You're focused on your very narrow part. And as a result, people were like parts of a machine. And there were a lot of concerns about this way of doing things in factories, that it was the Industrial Revolution times 1,000. And yes, many things were produced very quickly for cheaper, and the people were even making more money to do it. But the life that they were leading was alarming to people, and it reminded people that this can happen in our world in general, that if the government wants things to be more efficient, the government could just assign everybody jobs, and then everybody does their part, and they don't really know the big picture, and we're all parts of a machine. If you've ever read the book The Giver, you might understand that idea. There are many books that talk about dystopia. That is the idea that you have a society or a civilization that's gone off track. And even though things are technologically advanced, they may not be going the right direction. Now, I do need to mention that Henry Ford actually had personal ideas that he published. And these ideas were anti-Semitic. They were anti-Jewish. And so some people would even say that Henry Ford's success and his name recognition, people knew who he was, and when he published something, it affected a lot of people, and people even say this might have led to the rise of Adolf Hitler. And so we need to know that words and feelings and ideas, they have consequences. And that means, the success of the automobile and the assembly line, and it also means the tragedy and the evil of, ideas that are related to racism and anti-Semitism. A person who suffered because of anti-Semitism was Albert Einstein. Now, we've already discussed him, so you all know E equals MC squared. And you know that he developed this theory of relativity, and that connects to atomic energy, which is a big part of the story of the 20th century. Well, Albert Einstein was Jewish, and he actually he lived in Germany, but he left Germany in the late 1800s. And that was a time when, remember, Germany was becoming more militaristic, bigger military. And so he, once Germany became a country in, 1871, then Germany wanted to be stronger and stronger, and the idea of anti-Semitism started taking root, even in the late 1800s. So it's not all Hitler's fault, although he really obviously took it to a whole new level. But the main thing is that it was widespread, and Einstein was feeling it. He denounced, he renounced his citizenship of Germany. And, he settled in Switzerland. And the thing is, he actually was in Switzerland without a home, without a nationality or a state, and for about 5 years. Eventually, he gained his Swiss citizenship, but as the 1930s went on, he was not safe in Switzerland. He went on trips around the world speaking on his ideas, his theories, and when he was in the United States, Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933. And he realized it was not safe for him to go back to Germany. So eventually he became a U.S. citizen in 1940. So that kind of covers the period that we're talking about, the 20s and the 30s. And during the 20s, he was gaining lots of recognition. I want to mention his Annus Mirabilis. This video about technology is all about modern magic. And the word Annus Mirabilis means wonder year, year of wonders, year of magic. And For Albert Einstein, his annus mirabilis was 1905, when he published 4 groundbreaking articles about quantum mechanics, about how atoms work and how atomic energy works. And so that was his annus mirabilis. But I'm going to talk about that word several times during this video. So you'll see many people have an annus mirabilis, and I would say the modern period had an annus mirabilis in 1922. Let's talk about another scientist who explored atomic energy and atomic structure, and that's Niels Bohr. Now, I've always said Niels Bohr. That's, I think, how my teacher said it long ago, but I've done some research. Niels Bohr is his name. He was from Denmark, and he had an annus mirabilis in 1922 when he received the Nobel Prize for Physics, and he is best known because he established the model that atoms have, the nucleus, and then they have levels of electrons, energy levels. And so you've probably learned this in science at some point, but the point is that he also understood that electrons could jump from one level to another, and that was an explanation of how atomic energy worked. He also studied light, and he's most famous probably for the idea that light is both like a wave and a group of particles. So the question that scientists had was, what is light? How can we describe it? And some people thought it was like a wave, and other people thought it was particles, like little parts all together. And Niels Bohr said it's actually okay to think of it through both models. And even though they seem like they don't go together, it's important for us to think about things in different ways, and that helps science move forward. So we still today, in your physics class someday or in the past, it is discussed that light is both like a wave and particles. So I hope that gives you some background for these 3 figures. Now, what were the effects of science? In everyday life, things were changing dramatically. First of all, household appliances were being created like crazy. Remember, Thomas Edison had been the master inventor, creating the electric light and things like that, and that changed the quality of life for people. But now you had things like the blender, the toaster, things that we just take for granted, the iron for an ironing board that was plugged into the wall. And so you had electricity being used in all kinds of new ways. And so household appliances were exploding, hopefully not literally exploding, but they were developing, and everybody had access because the economy was doing so well. Now, this is the thing. If the economy is doing well, people are making money, and then they start buying things, and that keeps the economy doing well. So it all works together. Now, another practical application of science in people's lives was through medicine. Penicillin was discovered at this time. Imagine what life was like with infections that couldn't be treated before penicillin. And penicillin was discovered because of bread mold. That's what penicillin came from. And so it's just a remarkable thing, an ordinary thing, kind of like Einstein's E equals mc squared. Such a simple equation, but such enormous consequences. And the iron lung is another development. In 1928, the first iron lung was developed because polio was such a widespread disease, especially among children, and it would paralyze a child's lungs. And so children could die very easily because they couldn't breathe. And so a respirator, a machine that helps you breathe, was created, and it was made of iron at first. It was the drinker machine. That was the name of the man who created it. And the thing is, other people had the same idea, and so eventually he lost his patent. He lost his claim to that machine. But the iron lung was kind of like this space capsule, and a person had to be slid in, and they just had their head out, and it was very claustrophobic. And so a lot of people had fear of the iron lung, even though it was such a great life-saving device. It was based on the idea of negative pressure, that if you basically you lower the pressure, and it will help your lungs expand, okay, because you've lowered the pressure outside. And so now we have positive pressure respiration, which basically forces air into someone's lungs, and that's what we do today. So it's different from the iron lung. I hope this gives you a little bit of background. I know this has been a little bit long, but we'll shorten up the other sections and get her done. Off we go into the wild blue yonder, up, up and away. That was the Roaring Twenties, and we've already discussed the idea of the annus mirabilis. Now, 1922 is a fascinating year because 1922 was a year when a lot of famous literature came out. It was also the year that Niels Bohr won the Nobel Prize. 1922 was kind of a key year when things were happening all over the world. And we'll talk in a little bit about how roads were built like crazy in the year 1922. So if you don't remember anything else, just remember 1922 was a year of wonders. Well, during the 1920s, many wonders were being experienced. And a book of marvels, not Marvel Comics, but a book that talked about wonderful things, was written by a man named Richard Halliburton. And he was an author during the 1920s, but he wasn't just an author, he was an adventurer. And you know, with the Wright brothers basically flying the first plane just for a few seconds in 1903 at Kitty Hawk, that developed so that you had planes during World War I, and then in the 1920s, you had planes for recreation and adventure. And if you had enough money, or if you had enough connections, then you could become a pilot. And so this is a part of the culture, you know, expanding the world and pushing boundaries just because you can, because you have the money to do that and the time. And so Richard Halliburton represented this idea, and he wrote his Book of Marvels because of the experiences that he had doing things like swimming across, he swam the Panama Canal. That's one example. He crossed a waterfall. I don't think on a tightrope, but he, you know, crazy things that other people wouldn't dare do. He flew to remote places and would write about them. And eventually he tried to take a Chinese boat all the way from China to the United States, to San Francisco, and was never heard from again, kind of like another person that we'll talk about in a minute. And there was another couple, a married couple, who were adventurers, and you might know the movie Up, a Disney movie called Up. And it's actually made based on this couple, and their names were Martin and Osa Johnson, and they were from Independence, Kansas, which is actually the small town in Kansas where my family is from. My family had connections to Independence, Kansas. So the Johnsons were famous because they went to remote islands, and then they'd come back and they'd talk. They'd give speeches all over the country. And, you know, they had this love affair with each other because they were husband and wife, but also with adventure. Now, two other figures we need to know. Charles Lindbergh. And he famously became the first man to fly across the Atlantic by himself nonstop. And that was in 1927 in May. And so when we talk about May Day, it's not just crashing, it's also the success of Charles Lindbergh flying for 33 and a half hours, 3,600 miles. Unbelievable achievement. And he did it by himself. And it's an advance of technology. It's also an advance of the human spirit to be brave enough to do that. And Amelia Earhart also started flying in the 1920s and making a name for herself. But it's very clear that Lindbergh was more famous than Earhart in some ways. And eventually Earhart, in the 1930s, she would try to fly around the world, only with one person with her, a navigator, but it wasn't nonstop. She did stop, but the idea was she wanted to be the first one, and she didn't quite make it, and her plane disappeared. And some people speculate whether she was captured by the Japanese. It was the late 1930s, and the Japanese didn't want people spying on them as they prepared for war. Also in the world, you have entertainment. And so again, if you have money, you have time on your hands, and you want to spend your money. And so Hollywood movies, they started out as silent movies, but then they became talkies. And in 1927, you had the first talking movie, The Jazz Singer, with Al Jolson. And before that, again, you had silent movies with Charlie Chaplin, and he continued doing movies all the way through the 20s into the 30s. And he actually had one of the most famous movies about Hitler. And The Great Dictator is the name of that movie. And it was a satire because Charlie Chaplin knew that Adolf Hitler was doing terrible things in Germany. And this is during the 1930s, so before World War II. And he was instrumental in making people aware that he was crazy and was very dangerous. And one more person we should talk about is Cecil B. DeMille. Cecil B. DeMille was a great film director, and he created movies. One of them, The King of Kings, was a very important movie, and it was about Jesus's life, and it was an epic movie. And it's kind of fascinating to think that back then, some of the biggest Hollywood blockbusters were these religious movies, whether The King of Kings or The Ten Commandments, which he also did. Not the famous one with Charlton Heston later on, but an early version. So I hope this helps you understand that it was a very diverse time, lots going on, successes for both men and women and married couples, and just a lot of interesting stuff to research on your own. Now, we've discussed a lot how communication has developed, and I don't think that this segment will be very long because you know about the telegraph, you know how that was developed, you know that the telegraph cables were laid across the oceans. On the bottom of the sea, you had these transatlantic cables, trans-Pacific cables, and that made the world seem like a smaller place. Then you had the invention of the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell, and it's an amazing thing that invention. It seems so ordinary to us, especially since we carry them around in our hands and pockets now, everywhere. And it all started with Alexander Graham Bell, and the first private telephone in the United States was owned by Mark Twain. You wonder who he was talking to. I guess government people, because the government, the military, they always kind of have those inventions because they have money to invest in them. They have those inventions early on. So the telephone changed things, but it was wireless. The wireless telegraph and then wireless radio. That is what shaped the 20th century. All the way back to the Titanic. Wireless telegraph was used to send out Morse code. That was huge, but unfortunately, at the time of the Titanic, not enough people were familiar with it. It was a novelty, and so people did not take the messages seriously. Instead, people on board the Titanic, they were sending out garbage messages like we do today. You know, we're tweeting or we're texting or whatever, and there are so many more important things to say, especially in the middle of a tragedy. Well, this leads us to the invention of the 1920s, the radio. Now, radio had been developing, and Marconi usually gets the credit for that, but there are others, plenty of others who deserve credit, including Nikola Tesla. And so, who gets credit? It doesn't really matter. It's humanity that is blessed by God, right? And so, radio broadcasting takes root in the 1920s. And this started with things like reports of election results, because that's what everybody needed to know quickly, right? It used to take weeks before people even knew who won the presidential election, like President Lincoln's election. But this could be an instant thing now with radio broadcasting to a mass audience. We call this mass communication. And in addition, you had things like music. Okay, it wasn't all just news. It was music that was being broadcast, and eventually they started broadcasting a little bit of speeches that were given, some kinds of literature, famous literature from the past that could be read over the radio. Remember, the quality was still pretty low, but people had a lot of patience. They would sit and listen for a long time. The writer that I am learning a lot about, because I'm doing some coursework, some schoolwork related to this writer, his name is Richard Hughes, and he wrote the first play for the radio. And it's kind of amazing, because now we just take it for granted that you write certain kinds of plays and stories for television or movies, but this was the first one ever made for radio. And so the BBC was created in 1923, and so that's kind of the beginning of the 1920s, and radio just exploded, and everybody was buying radios for their own homes to be a part of this movement. Another thing that was making the world a smaller place was the postal system. And, before it had, back to the Pony Express, it had taken a long time for letters to get places in the United States, and so people didn't have very high expectations. But through the war, World War I, many military vehicles were created, and then after the war, those vehicles, they didn't really have the same use. So the military actually was able to give their trucks to the postal system, and that meant that you could get your letters through in wind and snow and sleet and hail and whatever weather conditions were out there. And so that became kind of the motto of the postal system, that they could deliver it no matter what. Now, communication then is very closely connected to transportation, and we've already touched on this in various ways, but I will go a little bit further and say, railroads had been increasing and expanding throughout the United States to the point where the economy improved because of this ease of moving products around. But eventually, automobiles would be the way of the future, because you didn't need those railroad tracks. You could go into country towns. And so, one of the things that needed to happen as a result was the building of roads, and we'll talk about that in a second. In addition, you have planes that are, carrying mail. First of all, the improvement of the postal system wasn't just through trucks, it was also through air mail. And planes were taking passengers to foreign countries, and, again, not across the Atlantic, like we're used to, or across the Pacific like we're used to if we've ever been to Hawaii or Taiwan. So ocean liners were still the thing, and you had companies like the White Star Line. That was the Titanic's company, and it was still a thriving company even into the 1920s. You had the Queen Mary that was built, and so luxury on board these ocean liners became very important, and safety as well. They learned a little bit from the Titanic and the Lusitania, right? And so the world was opening up because of these new ways to travel, and this was known as the golden age of road building. It's peacetime, and during peacetime you have resources. So during World War I, roads weren't getting built because there weren't workers and there wasn't money. That was all being channeled to the war effort. But after the war, you have all this stuff that you can use, and money that you can use, and people that you can use to build roads. And so highways were built all over the United States. And we said the Annus Mirabilis, the year of wonders of 1922, that was a key year. And just in that year alone, twice as many roads were built as had been built before during the modern era of road building. But not everybody wanted to leave the place they were in. Many people wanted to make their homes even bigger and better, and they were reaching for the sky. And there was a movement, an art movement called the Art Deco movement during the 1920s, and it really captured the spirit of modernism. You had interesting angles to things, and lots of glass and metal that would reflect the sun. And maybe the most famous example is the one we'll talk about last year. I'll just save that, keep you in suspense. Frank Lloyd Wright had been a builder all the way, in the early part of the 1900s. And Frank Lloyd Wright is very famous, especially in Chicago, but in cities all over the United States, in towns all over the United States, because his style was related to what was called the arts and crafts movement. And so you had a little bit of a reflection of, some old-fashioned ways of doing things, but, the Art Deco movement and Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture, it was very modern thinking. And so if you ever are, you might come across a building that was built by Frank Lloyd Wright, and he had many different periods where he experimented with different styles, but his name is probably the most famous name for the builder of homes or buildings. Now, people didn't want to just build their own home. They wanted to build a home for humanity, and so they built skyscrapers because they had new materials to build with, concrete and steel, and they could build tall buildings, skyscrapers. And so in New York City and in Chicago, you have these massive buildings that were being built. The Empire State Building is maybe the most famous one, and it was a symbol of the modernist movement, or of the this Art Deco movement, and it's got very plain lines in some ways, and so it's not fancy like something from the 1800s or 1700s, but I should say the older centuries. It's a little bit like what the buildings in Washington D.C. look like, where you're imitating the Greeks and the Romans. But there's something different about it because of the materials. It's not marble, it's concrete and steel, and as many windows as you can get to let more light in. So it's kind of like a new Gothic cathedral, and there are certain Gothic elements in the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building. You can see it's almost like a castle that's being built in the middle of a city. So I hope all of these things just make you think about how vibrant the 1920s were, and there are a lot of positives here, and I hope we can have hope for ourselves, for humanity, because of these achievements that we've accomplished. Thanks for watching.